When the first faint light of dawn touched the worn stones of medieval London, the city awoke, not with a rush, but with a weary sigh, as though each street and roof beam remembered the endless days before it. The air hung heavy with the mingled smells of damp straw, coal smoke, and the river's slow decay. From the crooked timbers of half-leaning houses to the distant toll of a church bell, the city stretched and stirred in its slow rhythm of survival. People did not rise early because they wished to greet the morning, but because the morning demanded their labor. The baker's apprentice would be at the oven before the first cock crowed, his hands covered in coarse flour that scratched against dry skin, while the fishmonger trudged from the wharf with his baskets of catch, wrapped in seaweed and the cold breath of the Thames. The streets, slick with mud and refuse, echoed with a mixture of hoofbeats, clattering wheels, and the murmuring chorus of voices too tired to shout. Women with baskets of vegetables shuffled beside men with sacks of coal, and children darted through the fog-like shadows, sent to fetch water or scraps from the marketplace. In this place, every soul had a purpose, yet few had hope. Life was not about prosperity, but about endurance, about stretching one more day's worth of strength into the next uncertain dawn, even in the softest light. The city was a collage of hardship. The narrow alleys, slick with morning dew and yesterday's waste, framed a vision both ordinary and eternal. The same hands mending torn boots, the same backs bending under the same burdens. The distant toll of church bells reminded everyone of God and time, though neither offered much comfort to those whose stomachs grumbled louder than prayers. The air was never clean. It carried the taste of smoke, sweat, and something faintly metallic, like the echo of tools scraping against stone. Yet, within this dull symphony of labor, there was an odd sort of peace, a resignation that came from knowing one's place in the great machinery of the city. Each person, from the cobbler to the washerwoman, understood that London itself was alive, breathing through their effort, pulsing through their footsteps. The merchants arranged their stalls with practiced indifference, displaying goods that few could afford. The beggars waited in silence, hoping not for charity, but for chance. Above them, gulls wheeled and cried, their thin voices mingling with the rising hum of the waking streets. To make a living here was not to climb, nor to conquer. It was simply to persist, to outlast the day without collapsing under the invisible weight of survival. There were no shortcuts, no fortunes waiting to be found in the shadow of London Bridge or beside the river's slow current. Every loaf of bread, every cup of ale, every patched garment carried within it the story of exhaustion. Yet somehow, that exhaustion held the city together, binding its people in a quiet, stubborn unity. As the morning sun finally broke through the mist, its light revealed not glory, but continuity. Faces lined by effort, hands hardened by habit, and eyes that had long since stopped expecting anything new. This was London, not as legend, but as life, a place where each dawn began the same way it ended, with the faint, dull promise of another day survived. In medieval London, to be poor was not an accident. It was an inheritance, a condition passed quietly from one generation to the next, like the air that hung low over the river. The working poor filled every narrow crevice of the city's life, from the fish markets of Billingsgate to the smoky forges beyond the city wall. Their world was built not upon dreams, but upon repetition, the same tasks, the same hunger, the same aching hands, moving through the endless circle of necessity. The carpenter's hammer rang out against warped timber. The washerwoman bent over gray water that froze her fingers, and the tanner stood knee-deep in the stench of hides and lime. For each coin earned, there was another spent before it could even warm the palm. Food was never abundant, and shelter was never secure. The rents claimed by landlords were relentless, and so the poor found themselves forever behind, forever trying to catch up to a life that refused to wait for them. There was no mercy in the streets, not from the city, not from the sky, and rarely from each other. Children learned quickly that play was a luxury reserved for those who could afford it. The boys carried messages for pennies or scavenged scraps from refuse heaps, while girls were sent into service in the homes of merchants, scrubbing floors or tending fires until their backs stiffened before adulthood. To grow old was to defy the odds. To survive past 40 was to be considered lucky. Yet, despite the exhaustion and dirt, the poor persisted, their lives forming the foundation upon which the city's wealth quietly stood. The baker's bread, the tailor's cloth, the mason's stone, all were shaped by hands that would never taste the comfort of the things they made. The city's noise was their song, its hunger their chorus, its silence at night their uneasy rest. And though the rich passed by in fine cloaks and polished boots, they could not escape the labor of the poor that supported their every step. There were guilds that promised protection, but even they served mostly those who could afford the dues. The rest worked without safeguard, vulnerable to the whim of illness, accident, or the simple cruelty of a bad season. A broken hand meant starvation. A sickness could erase an entire family from the rolls of existence. London was not cruel by design. It was cruel by indifference. Its heart beat to the rhythm of trade and survival, not compassion. And yet, beneath all this, there was a strange resilience, a dull, uncelebrated endurance that held the city together. The poor laughed when they could, shared when they were able, and clung to faith because faith was free. They listened to the church bells not for hope, but for structure, the sound that marked their labor, their meals, and their brief moments of rest. As dusk settled and the smoky air thickened once more, they would gather in small taverns or dark corners of alleys, trading stories more than ale, speaking softly of nothing and everything, the price of bread, the weather, the rumors of plague, the dreams they no longer believed in. The struggle of the working poor was not heroic, nor was it tragic in the way stories like to tell. It was simply continuous, an unbroken thread of labor that stretched through the centuries, binding the city's history with sweat, breath, and quiet endurance. To make a living in medieval London was to work without end, to give more than one received, and to find, in the dull weight of repetition, the smallest comfort of belonging to something larger than oneself, even if that something was struggle itself. The markets of medieval London were the slow-beating heart of the city, a place where every breath of trade, every clatter of a coin seemed to echo through the centuries. Long before the sun reached its full height, the square at Cheapside was alive with the dull murmur of bargaining voices, the squeak of wooden carts, and the steady rhythm of footsteps moving over uneven cobblestones. It was not a place of wealth, though gold occasionally passed through it. Rather, it was a theater of survival, where people came not to prosper, but simply to endure another week. The air was thick with the smell of salted fish, unwashed wool, and the sharp tang of vinegar. Merchants stood behind tables covered with cloth, candles, pottery, or meager food, each one calling softly to the passing crowd, not with enthusiasm, but with the practiced tone of someone who had done the same thing every day for years. The buyers moved slowly, their eyes cautious, weighing the price of a loaf of bread against the value of a day's labor. Money, if it could be called that, was a fickle friend, copper pennies that lost their worth in a single bad season, or thin silver coins that passed through too many hands to remember. For many, barter was easier than coin. A shoemaker might trade a pair of patched boots for a sack of onions. A washerwoman might exchange her service for a bit of firewood or stale bread. The market was a living web of quiet desperation, a place where value was not measured in wealth, but in necessity. And though there were larger traders who handled goods from distant lands, spices from the east, furs from the north, or wine from the French coast, these were luxuries that most Londoners would never taste. Their world was smaller, limited to the rough grain of bread and the dull weight of coins that barely filled their palms. The city's economy, though bustling to the eye, was fragile beneath the surface. A single poor harvest, a rise in taxes, or a sudden outbreak of sickness could send the balance tumbling, leaving the markets emptier, the voices quieter, the prices crueler. The money itself had a strange presence, both precious and meaningless. A man could work from dawn until dusk and still find that his wages vanished before he reached home. A penny might buy a loaf of bread, or it might buy nothing, depending on who asked and when. There were no banks for the poor, no safety for their savings, no promise that tomorrow's market would bring anything different. Yet, still, they came, drawn by the faint pulse of exchange, by the hope that a few coins might be enough to hold life together. The market was not just an economic space. It was social, human, heavy, with the dull companionship of shared hardship. Here, gossip and rumor spread faster than goods. Talk of the king's taxes, of new tolls on the bridge, of the endless rise in the cost of everything. A man could spend his life in the market and never grow rich, but he could at least feel that he belonged to the rhythm of the city. As the day stretched into evening, the stalls began to close, their owners covering unsold goods with rough cloth. The light dimmed, and the sound of trade faded into the low hum of voices heading home through the mist. A few beggars lingered, searching the ground for dropped coins or crumbs. The air cooled, carrying with it the faint echo of the river. Tomorrow, the same merchants would return. The same coins would change hands, and the same weary faces would appear at the same stalls. There was comfort in the monotony, a dull, dependable repetition that made the city's poverty somehow bearable. In medieval London, the markets were not places of promise, but of persistence, where the value of money lay not in its shine, but in its ability to stretch one more day of life from an unforgiving world. In the quiet order of medieval London, the system of apprentices and masters formed the backbone of its trades, a slow and deliberate structure that defined how skill, discipline, and livelihood passed from one generation to another. To become an apprentice was not merely to learn a craft, it was to surrender one's youth to a life of obedience and repetition. 2 years spent in dim workshops, where the air was thick with sawdust, smoke, and the steady rhythm of labor. A boy might be 10 or 12 when his parents, unable to feed him, brought him before a guildmaster and signed his name to a parchment that bound him for 7 long years. In that moment, the boy ceased to belong to his family. He belonged to his trade. The master's shop became his world, its walls his boundaries, its tools his teachers, and its sounds the lullaby of his growing life. The mornings began before dawn, with the lighting of a single candle and the faint scrape of metal against wood. There was no talk of wages. An apprentice earned his keep in food, shelter, and the distant promise of freedom that waited at the end of his service. The masters themselves were not cruel by nature, but hardened by habit. They had lived their own apprenticeships, endured the same years of silence and fatigue, and so they passed that pattern on without question. Instruction came not through words, but through demonstration, a movement of the hand, a correction of posture, the subtle pressure of expectation that demanded perfection through patience. The guild system that oversaw them was both protection and prison. It gave structure to the chaos of the city's labor, ensuring that only those trained and approved could sell their work. But it also confined ambition, holding men tightly within the slow wheel of tradition. A carpenter would remain a carpenter. A smith would remain a smith. The path was narrow and unchanging. To step outside, it was to fall into the uncertain world of the poor, those who worked without guild, without title, and often without hope. Yet within this strict order, there was a kind of safety. An apprentice who survived his 7 years might one day become a journeyman, earning small wages and traveling from shop to shop, learning the nuances of his craft. And if fortune smiled, or if his master approved, he might, in time, become a master himself, with a shop of his own and an apprentice to continue the cycle. It was a slow climb, but it was a climb nonetheless. One of the few paths in medieval London where effort could, occasionally, lead to modest stability. Still, the cost was high. The boy who entered as an apprentice often emerged as a man stripped of softness, his body shaped by the rhythm of work, his spirit tempered by long years of discipline. In the evenings, when the shops closed and the last light faded from the narrow streets, apprentices would gather quietly, sharing stories of harsh masters or small triumphs, their laughter thin and brief. Some dreamed of freedom, of earning enough to open their own stalls. Others simply wished for a full meal and a night without pain in their hands. The city did not notice them much. They were part of its background hum, like the ringing of hammers or the creak of wooden wheels. And yet, without them, London would have faltered. Every chair, every door, every bridge and barrel bore the mark of some apprentice's patience, some master's stern eye. Theirs was a world of repetition and endurance, of small victories that went unseen. But within that monotony lay the quiet dignity of craft, the slow shaping of both wood and man, the transformation of raw material into something that, though ordinary, might last for centuries. As the sun sank behind the crooked rooftops of medieval London, the city seemed to exhale a long, tired breath after a day that had felt much like every other. The golden light of evening never reached far into the narrow streets. Instead, it broke softly upon the upper timbers of leaning houses, fading into the dim gray below. The air was heavy with smoke from countless hearths and the lingering scent of the river, thick and slow as it carried away the waste of the day. The market stalls, once noisy and alive, stood quiet now beneath rough linen covers, their owners trudging home with weary steps and the faint jingle of a few earned coins. From the alehouses came the muffled hum of voices, men speaking low of work, of weather, and of nothing in particular, their laughter tired, their faces lined with the small, unremarkable victories of survival. In the dim corners, beggars settled into sleep, curling against the cold stone walls, their rags offering little comfort against the chill that crept in with the dusk. The rhythm of the city slowed, but never stopped. Even as darkness gathered, there were still those who worked, night watchmen with lanterns dimmed by fog, bakers preparing dough for the next dawn, and washerwomen bent over the river, their pale hands moving in the half-light. The clop of hooves echoed faintly across London Bridge, fading into the murmur of water below. Somewhere, a church bell marked the hour, its tone heavy and distant, a reminder that time moved on whether or not anyone noticed. The city was neither awake nor asleep, caught instead in that endless twilight between exhaustion and endurance. Its people did not dream of rest. They merely accepted it, the way one accepts the changing of the tide. The poor lay close together for warmth. The merchants counted their day's earnings by candlelight, and apprentices mended tools in silence before the morning would call them back again. It was a world that moved in circles, the same labors, the same faces, the same slow beat of survival that had long ago replaced any notion of progress from the high towers of the churches. London looked almost peaceful. Smoke curled upward in thin ribbons, mingling with the mist that drifted in from the Thames. The noise of the day, the shouting, the trading, the hammering, had softened into a dull hum, like the faint heartbeat of something too large to see. Yet beneath that calm surface was the weight of countless small struggles, lives woven tightly together in the quiet fabric of the city's persistence. The streets that by day were filled with urgency now belonged to silence, broken only by the rustle of rats or the whisper of wind through narrow gaps in the wood. Lanterns flickered in windows, small stars against the darkness, marking the homes of those who, for another night, had survived. And so London endured its evenings as it endured its days, without grandeur, without tragedy, but with the same slow, unending patience. The people of the city did not look toward the horizon for change. They looked instead to the next loaf of bread, the next morning's task, the next coin to be earned. The beauty of it all, if one could call it that, lay in the monotony, the steady pulse of human life that refused to stop. In the fading glow, the cobblestones glistened faintly, and the air was filled with the smell of rain yet to fall. Somewhere, a baby cried. Somewhere else, a man began to sing, his voice rough and low, drifting through the narrow lanes like a lullaby meant for no one. This was the endless evening of medieval London, not dark, not light, simply suspended in its own weary balance, where life and labor blended into one long, gentle sigh. In the slow rhythm of medieval life, bread was not simply food, it was existence itself, the quiet center around which all hunger and hope turned. Every household, rich or poor, measured its fortune by the presence or absence of bread. The smell of it, baking, faint and earthy, drifting through the narrow streets of London or the quiet fields of a distant village was the scent of survival. To the common laborer, bread was not a choice of taste or texture. It was whatever the harvest and the miller allowed. Most loaves were coarse, dark, and heavy, made from rye, barley, or oats, rather than the fine white wheat reserved for the wealthy. Bits of husk or grit often clung to the dough, giving it the rough edge of necessity. Each bite could grind the teeth, yet to those who ate it, this was the taste of life itself. Grain was the currency of existence, and to run short was to feel the cold shadow of famine pressing close. The making of bread was a task shaped by both time and toil. Women in cottages and city homes rose long before dawn, mixing flour with water, a little salt if fortune allowed, and sometimes a trace of yeast saved from the last batch. The dough was kneaded with patience, left to rise in the uncertain warmth of the hearth, and then baked upon stones blackened with years of use. In the towns, communal ovens stood at the heart of neighborhoods, small, smoky spaces where the poor paid a few coins or offered labor in exchange for baking their loaves. The bread that emerged from those ovens was not uniform. Some loaves were round and flat, others dense and misshapen, their crusts cracked like dry earth. Yet all carried the same quiet dignity of necessity. For most people, bread was eaten with nothing. No butter, no cheese, no meat. A little broth might soften it. A scrap of onion or a hint of garlic might lend it flavor. But even without such additions, it filled the stomach and silenced hunger, if only for a while. In years of plenty, the bread was plentiful too, and the city markets hummed with the sound of millstones grinding. But when the harvest failed, as it often did, when rain drowned the fields or frost struck early, the price of grain rose like a tide, and with it, despair. Poor families stretched their flour with peas, beans, or ground up weeds. Some even mixed sawdust or clay into the dough when nothing else remained. The loaves that emerged were bitter, heavy, and dangerous, but to starve was worse. The rich, of course, were spared such desperation. Their tables held soft, white manchet bread, baked from the finest sifted flour, its crust pale and smooth, its taste almost sweet. They ate it with butter, honey, and meat, while the poor chewed their coarse rye in silence. Bread was more than food, it was a mirror of society, showing clearly who lived in comfort and who merely survived. As night fell and the city quieted, the last scent of baking lingered in the damp air. It mixed with the smoke of hearths and the faint temps of the river. A reminder that tomorrow would begin the same way, with grain, with labor, with the endless shaping of dough into sustenance. For medieval people, bread was a ritual as much as a meal, a daily act of endurance, repeated until hands grew too old or harvests grew too thin. There was no romance in it, no luxury, only the slow comfort of continuity in the soft light of the hearth. A loaf cooling on a worn wooden board was not merely food. It was the quiet, stubborn proof that life, against all odds, went on. For most of medieval London's poor, a meal was not a pleasure to be savored, but a question of endurance, of how long the body could be persuaded to continue its quiet work with as little nourishment as possible. The poor man's meal was a thing of repetition, of sameness, of dull necessity. There were no feasts, no varied flavors, only the simple goal of staying alive from one day to the next. In the dark interiors of tenements or small, sagging cottages, people gathered around bowls of thin pottage, a watery stew of grains, and whatever scraps could be found. Barley, oats, peas, and lentils formed the base, boiled until they lost their shape, turning into a gray mass that could be swallowed easily, even by tired jaws. If fortune smiled, a few shreds of salted meat might float in the mix. If not, a bone was enough, its faint flavor steeped into the broth until it vanished. Herbs from the roadside or weeds from neglected gardens added the illusion of taste. It was not food meant to delight, it was food meant to fill. The fire that cooked this meal was often weak, fed by scraps of wood or dried dung. The smoke lingered thick in the small rooms, blackening the walls, clinging to the clothes and the air itself. Families sat close to the pot, waiting for the slow boil, passing the time in silence, broken only by coughs or the crackle of the flame. Children stared into the bubbling mixture as if it held some secret of life. When it was ready, the pottage was ladled into rough wooden bowls, sometimes shared between 2 or 3, each taking turns to dip a crust of bread, to scrape what little nourishment they could. There were no forks, no fine manners, only the rhythm of need, the spoon moving from pot to mouth in slow, practiced motions. To eat was to survive, and survival was the only luxury they could afford. In the poorer districts near the river, where the smell of fish and filth filled the air, some families lived on what they could gather or beg. The refuse of markets became their pantry. Wilted vegetables, broken eggs, bones stripped clean of meat. At times, the Thames itself offered sustenance. Small fish caught in baskets, shellfish dug from the muddy banks, though often tainted by the city's waste. Hunger did not discriminate, and so neither did those who suffered it. When famine struck or wages failed, even the poorest scraps became precious. Mothers gave their portions to children. The old pretended to have eaten already. The body grew thin, the skin pale, and yet life clung stubbornly on. To starve was to disappear, and so people learned to eat whatever could be eaten, no matter how humble, no matter how foul. Still, there was a strange, quiet grace in those small, colorless meals. In the glow of the hearth, surrounded by tired faces and the faint hum of prayer or gossip, even the poor man's meal carried a kind of ritual dignity. It bound families together, gave rhythm to days that might otherwise dissolve into despair. When the bowl was empty and the fire burned low, there was always a faint, stubborn hope that tomorrow might bring something more, a crust of fresh bread, a bit of cheese, a drop of ale. Hunger was constant, but so was endurance. The people of medieval London learned to live with less, to make something out of almost nothing, to find in the plain taste of barley and onion a memory of comfort that the world otherwise denied them. In that quiet act, the slow stirring of a pot, the soft clink of a wooden spoon, they kept not only their bodies alive, but the fragile, flickering spirit of ordinary life. While the poor of medieval London filled their bellies with pottage and crusts of coarse bread, the wealthy dined in a world that might as well have belonged to another planet, though even their splendor, seen through the slow passage of time, seems muted, heavy, and strangely distant. A feast in a noble hall was not just a meal. It was a performance, a slow parade of abundance, meant to affirm one's place in the fragile hierarchy of the world. The great halls were long and dim, their rafters heavy with smoke and the scent of burning tallow. The walls often hung with tapestries depicting hunts or battles, flickered with the light of hundreds of candles, their wax pooling silently upon iron stands. At the long central table sat the Lord and his family, their garments rich with color, their hands washed in rosewater before the first course. Servants moved in practiced rhythm, carrying great platters of roasted meats. Venison, boar, goose, or swan, their surfaces glistening with fat and spice. Each dish was an act of spectacle, seasoned not only for taste but for display. The meals could last for hours. After the meats came pies stuffed with minced fowl, fruit, and even fish. Their crusts golden and flaky, their tops decorated with carved shapes of flowers or coats of arms. Platters of fresh bread stood beside silver cups of wine and ale, and the sound of knives against trenchers mingled with the faint echoes of a lute or harp, played somewhere near the back of the hall. The smell was thick, roasting flesh, cinnamon, honey, and the faint sweetness of mead. Yet beneath the grandeur was something curiously still. For all the noise and chatter, a medieval feast was a ritual of repetition, as structured as any prayer. Each gesture, each serving, each toast followed the same pattern, the same solemn rhythm of abundance. To be wealthy was to eat not out of hunger, but out of habit, to fill the silence with ceremony, to prove through excess that one could command the labor of others. The food itself reflected the boundaries of privilege. Spices like saffron, pepper, and ginger were symbols of status, their cost greater than gold by weight. The poor might live their entire lives without tasting them, but at a noble table, their scent filled the air. Fruits from distant lands, figs, pomegranates, and oranges appeared like miracles upon the plates, their colors a reminder of how far power could reach. Yet, for all the variety, the meals were not comfortable. The rooms were cold, the air thick, and the food, once removed from its fire, cooled quickly. There were no forks yet, only knives, spoons, and hands. The Lord ate first, his guests in descending order of rank. Servants waited silently, watching, hoping for scraps when the courses were done. Beneath the grand show of plenty, there was always the shadow of need, not among the guests, but among those who served them. When the feast finally ended, bones and crumbs were swept away to the hounds, and the tables were cleared with slow efficiency. The Lord might rise and offer a brief prayer or retire to another chamber, his hunger long gone, but his performance complete. The guests drifted out, their laughter soft and fading, their footsteps echoing against the stone. The candles burned lower, the music stilled, and in the corners of the hall, servants quietly ate what remained: the cold meat, the broken crusts, the scraps of fruit no longer fit for display. The great feast, for all its noise and richness, ended in silence, like every other day in medieval London. The wealth of the few did not brighten the lives of the many. It only reminded them of the distance between hunger and satisfaction, between survival and spectacle. And when the candles were finally snuffed out, the hall, like the city itself, returned to darkness, its grandeur fading into the same slow, endless night. In the slow, uncertain rhythm of medieval life, the act of drinking was never simple refreshment. It was survival, wrapped in ritual and risk. The water that flowed through the streets of London was as treacherous as the city itself, carrying with it the waste of thousands and the silent poisons of disease. Few trusted it, and fewer still drank it willingly. The Thames, wide and constant, looked peaceful from a distance, but its depths held the decay of human life, refuse, blood from the butcher's quarter, the drift of dead animals, and the unseen spread of sickness. And so the people turned to other things to quench their thirst. The most common of all was ale, that warm, cloudy drink that seemed to fill every mug, every tavern, and every weary mouth in London. It was not the ale we know today, but a mild, thick brew made from malted barley, water, and yeast, sometimes flavored faintly with herbs like bog, myrtle, or rosemary. It was cheap, nourishing, and, most importantly, safer than water. Even children drank it, and households brewed their own, each batch a little different from the last. The making of ale was a household art. Called alewives tended the brew pots in their smoky kitchens, stirring the mash with long wooden paddles, watching carefully as the mixture frothed and hissed. When it was ready, it was poured into rough wooden barrels and sold by the jug or cup to neighbors. The smell of ale, yeasty, sour, and faintly sweet, drifted through the streets like a constant reminder of both life and labor. But ale did not keep well. Within days it could sour, turning sharp and unpleasant, and so it had to be made again and again in a never-ending cycle. Stronger drinks were rare. Wine, imported from France or Spain, was the privilege of nobles and wealthy merchants. It was stored in cellars, poured into silver goblets, and mixed, sometimes with honey, spices, or herbs to mask its roughness. To drink wine was to display wealth, to hold in one's cup the taste of distance and trade. Yet even the rich could not escape the hazards of the medieval table. The wine could spoil, the ale could turn, and the water was always dangerous. There were those who drank cider or mead, sweetened with apples or honey, but these were luxuries for most. In the taverns and alehouses, the drink of the people remained the same, the humble ale, served lukewarm in thick, uneven mugs. The taverns themselves were dim and noisy, filled with the smell of sweat, smoke, and damp straw. Men sat hunched over their cups, talking of work and weather, or saying nothing at all. The ale loosened tongues but dulled minds, and many found in its haze a brief escape from hunger and hardship. It was said that a man could forget his misery after 3 jugs, but by morning the misery always returned. For women, too, ale was both necessity and burden. Alewives who brewed too weakly or overcharged customers could face the pillory, a wooden frame that held the body for public shame. In this, as in all things, the city watched and judged, measuring even its drink by law and custom by night. When the fires burned low and the streets emptied, the sound of mugs and laughter faded into a kind of quiet melancholy. Somewhere, a barrel leaked, dripping softly into the dark. The ale had kept the people alive, but it also carried them away into stupor, into sickness, into the slow forgetting that came from too much labor and too little hope. To drink in medieval London was to balance between safety and sickness, comfort and decay. And yet, in that balance, the city endured each sip, a small act of trust in a world where nothing, not even water, could be taken for granted. In the shadowed alleys of medieval London, hunger was not an event, but a season, a slow, creeping visitor that came and stayed, touching every door, sparing no heart completely. It was a rhythm the people knew as well as the tolling of the church bell. After the harvest came the months of endurance, when grain stores thinned and meat hung scarce in the market. The rich locked their pantries and cellars, guarding their wine and wheat with quiet vigilance, while the poor turned again to the bare cupboards of their cottages, counting crusts, measuring grain by handfuls. Hunger had no shape, no sound, only the stillness it left behind, the slow way people moved, the hollow eyes of children, the faint trembling in an old man's hand as he lifted an empty bowl. Yet, somehow, even in that bleak silence, life did not end. It simply adjusted, reshaped itself into patience. A little broth was stretched with water. Stale bread was soaked until soft, and every meal, no matter how meager, was taken with the small prayer that tomorrow might bring more in the city's narrow lanes, where refuse and rainwater ran together. Hunger showed itself most clearly. Bakers' shops glowed faintly with warmth, their windows fogged with the breath of rising loaves, and the poor gathered near them like moths to a fading flame. The smell of bread became both comfort and torment, proof that food existed somewhere, just not for them. Beggars waited outside taverns, hoping for scraps from plates, a sip of ale left behind. The bells of churches rang for vespers, but for many, prayer and hunger were one and the same. The priests spoke of patience, of divine reward for those who suffered quietly, and people listened, not because they believed entirely, but because belief was the only thing they could still afford. In the countryside beyond London's walls, peasants faced the same slow struggle. The fields promised plenty in summer, but could not be trusted in winter. A single storm, a single frost, could turn full barns into empty ones. And so they learned to endure not heroically, not tragically, but simply, day by day, with the same quiet persistence as the river flowing through the city's heart. Yet, amid that hunger, there was also hope, not loud or sudden, but faint and constant, like the steady glow of embers long after the fire has died. Hope was the promise of a new harvest, the rumor of a generous Lord, the kindness of a neighbor who shared half a loaf. It was found in the marketplace at dawn, when traders arrived with carts of grain and the smell of life returned to the streets. It was in the laughter of children who had not yet learned to despair, in the songs sung softly by women as they kneaded dough with tired hands. The people of medieval London were not dreamers by choice, but by necessity. They hoped because there was nothing else to do, because without that faint light of tomorrow, the long nights would have swallowed them whole. And so each day began the same, with the slow rising of smoke from hearths, the first grind of the millstone, the creak of carts rolling through the mud. The hunger never truly ended. It merely slept for a while, waiting for its next season. But in those in-between days, when the bread was warm and the ale fresh, when the children smiled and the sky softened with spring, life returned in quiet, stubborn beauty. It was not an age of plenty, nor of comfort, but it was an age of endurance. The people of that time, poor, weary, forgotten, carried within them a strength deeper than any feast or fortune. And though their names are lost, their small acts of survival, their whispered prayers before each meal, remain woven into the long, dim fabric of history. In every loaf, in every sip, in every flicker of hope against hunger's cold hand, the story of medieval life goes on endlessly ordinary, endlessly human. In the dim heart of medieval London, beneath the steady drone of market bells and the distant murmur of the Thames, there was the constant ring of the blacksmith's hammer, a sound so ordinary that few noticed it, yet it carried the rhythm of the city's survival. The blacksmith's forge was a small universe of its own, a low, smoky workshop filled with the smell of iron, soot, and sweat. In that flickering half-light, the blacksmith stood before his fire like a priest before an altar, coaxing life from cold metal with nothing but strength and patience. The air shimmered with heat, each strike sending sparks that glowed for a heartbeat before vanishing into the gloom. He shaped nails for carpenters, horseshoes for traders, hinges for doors, and blades for those who could afford them. Nothing grand, nothing adorned, just the simple, endless transformation of raw ore into something useful. It was a craft learned by doing, passed from father to son, from master to apprentice. The young boys began with small tasks, pumping the bellows, fetching water, gathering charcoal, their hands blistered, their faces darkened by smoke. Over years, the rhythm of hammer and anvil became as natural as breathing. The forge was hot in summer and bitterly cold in winter, but the work never stopped. The fire, once lit, had to be kept alive. The iron, once heated, had to be struck before it cooled. A moment's delay could ruin hours of labor. And yet, in that monotony, there was a strange dignity. The blacksmith's fire, always burning, was a symbol of endurance, one of the few steady lights in a city often dimmed by hunger, sickness, and uncertainty. Customers came and went, farmers needing tools mended, soldiers seeking to sharpen swords, merchants wanting locks for their chests. They came with coins if they had them, or with goods to barter if they did not. Sometimes the blacksmith was paid in bread, sometimes in ale, sometimes not at all. Still, he worked, because work was life, and idle hands were a kind of death. His shop stood near the edge of the marketplace, where the noise of hawkers and horses mixed with the hiss of steam and the clang of metal. To passers-by, the sound was just another piece of London's great, unending hum. But for those who lived by the forge, it was music, harsh, repetitive, and eternal. When the day ended and the fire was finally left to fade, the blacksmith's arms hung heavy, his back bent from years of labor. He wiped his brow with a cloth blackened by soot, drank from a small jug of ale, and stepped outside into the cool night. The stars above the city were faint, dimmed by the smoke of 1,000 hearths, but still they glimmered faintly, like sparks from his forge carried upward into the sky. He thought little of glory or wealth. His work was its own reward, his legacy built not in words, but in the silent strength of things that lasted, a gate that would hold through the years, a plow that would turn the earth, a nail that would not bend. The world around him changed slowly, almost without notice, but the blacksmith's fire remained the same, a steady heart beating within the tired body of the city. And so, night after night, as London slept, that small forge, with its glowing coals and lingering smoke, kept the story of work alive, bright, hot, and endlessly patient. Long before the city stirred to life, when the mist still hung over the Thames like a thin veil of sleep. The washerwomen of medieval London were already awake, their hands numb from the cold, their skirts heavy with damp. They were the quiet laborers of cleanliness in a world where dirt was everywhere, in the streets, on the walls, in the air itself. Their work began with silence, the slow rhythm of footsteps through mud, baskets balanced on weary shoulders, the faint slosh of water echoing between the alleys, down by the riverbank or at the communal washing pools. They gathered women of every age, their faces lined not by years alone, but by toil and weather. They worked side by side, sometimes in laughter, sometimes in silence, each beating cloth against stone with a rhythm older than memory. The sound, steady, repetitive, almost like a chant carried across the water, a soft percussion marking the beginning of another day. Their hands were red and raw, cut by soap made from lye and ash. The water, even in summer, bit at their skin, and in winter it was cruel enough to make them weep. Yet the work could not stop, because filth never did. Inns, manors, monasteries, and households all needed clean linens, and the washerwomen were the city's unacknowledged pulse, scrubbing away the evidence of its living. They washed sheets stained by sickness, clothes stiff with sweat, rags from hospitals and taverns. There was no glamour, no gratitude, only the endless rhythm of wet cloth. The river itself bore witness, carrying away the suds and dirt, turning them into another layer of the city's slow decay. And still they labored, because to stop was to go hungry, and hunger was a language every poor woman knew too well. Sometimes they sang low, repetitive songs that mingled with the murmur of water. The songs were not joyful, but steady, as if to keep time with the aching of their arms. Children played nearby, their laughter thin and fleeting, chasing each other between baskets of wet linen. The washerwomen spoke of prices, of illness, of men who drank too much, of masters who paid too little. Their voices, carrying over the river's surface, sounded like the hum of wind through reeds, always there, always fading. At midday, they might pause to eat a crust of bread, their fingers still damp, their backs bent forward, even as they rested. Then the work began again, heavier now with fatigue, the sun rising higher, the clothes drying slower. When evening came, they walked home together through narrow streets, their skirts trailing mud, the smell of soap still clinging to their clothes. The city by then was awake and loud, carts creaking, bells tolling, merchants calling, but the washerwomen's world remained quiet. They had no time for the pace of others. Their rhythm belonged to the water and the weight of labor. At home, they tended to children, cooked what little they had, and mended their own worn garments before sleep. Their hands, even at rest, stayed curled, as if still gripping cloth. Few would remember their names, fewer still would thank them, but in the long memory of London, their labor lingered, the invisible, endless work that kept the city clean enough to carry on. Each washed sheet, each rinsed tunic, each careful wringing of fabric was a small act of order in a world ruled by filth and fatigue. And when night returned and the river once again grew still beneath the moon, it was as if their work had washed not only the city's clothes, but its weary soul, if only for a little while. When the first light of dawn crept through the narrow lanes of medieval London, the market sellers were already awake, moving through the gray fog like restless ghosts, burdened by baskets and hope. The markets were the city's heartbeat, noisy, muddy, alive. Yet beneath the clamor, there was always the quiet rhythm of survival. Women with scarves tied over their hair, men with carts and sacks, boys shouting prices they could barely afford to remember, all gathered in the same patch of cobblestone, day after day, to trade what they had for what they needed. The air was thick with smells: fish from the river, bread still warm from the oven, herbs crushed beneath hurried feet, and the faint sourness of damp wool and sweat. It was not a place of beauty, but of motion, of lives intersecting briefly under the gray English sky. Every voice carried both need and fatigue. Every bargain was a small act of endurance. The market sellers came from every corner of the city. Some were bakers, their stalls stacked with rough loaves, the crusts dusted with flour like pale dust from another world. Others sold fish, eels, herring, and carp laid out on wooden planks, slick with river water, their scales glinting faintly in the light. There were women who sold onions and leeks from baskets woven by hand, their fingers cracked from years of cold. Some men brought meat from the slaughterhouses, wrapped in coarse cloth and buzzing with flies, while others peddled cheap cloth or second-hand shoes. The richer markets were louder, with spices, cheese, and honey on display. But for most, trade was humble, close to the ground, heavy with the smell of the earth. They called out their wares in voices hoarse from repetition: fresh bread, warm bread, eels alive from the Thames. Their words, layered one over the other, became the city's morning song, both chaotic and strangely comforting. Yet behind the noise was an undercurrent of worry. Prices rose and fell without warning, and a single bad harvest could ruin a cellar for a year. Theft was common, so was deceit. Weights were rigged, coins clipped, and arguments often turned to fights. The city guards patrolled the markets, not for protection, but for order, ensuring that trade and the taxes it brought never stopped. Still, the sellers kept coming because they had no choice. For them, the market was not merely a place of work. It was the thin line between hunger and survival. A good day meant food for the family. A bad one meant going home with empty baskets and heavier hearts. They learned to smile when they were weary, to shout when they were afraid, to hide their worry behind the clatter of goods and coins. When noon came, the light brightened and the crowd thickened. Merchants from abroad passed through with foreign goods: salt from Brittany, wine from Bordeaux, wool from the Shires, and for a moment the city seemed vast, connected to the far reaches of the world. But as the sun dipped and the bells tolled the hour, the market began to fade. The sellers packed what remained, wiped their hands on their aprons, and watched as the crowd thinned into quiet. The ground was littered with cabbage leaves, broken bread, and mud. Children scavenged what was left. Dogs fought over scraps. And then, as evening drew its long shadow, the noise gave way to silence once again. The market was empty, yet its echoes lingered: faint laughter, distant shouting, the slow creak of a cartwheel rolling away. Tomorrow, it would begin again. The same faces, the same voices, the same endless rhythm of trade and endurance. In that repetition lay the strange, steady heart of medieval life, noisy, dirty, necessary, and profoundly human. In the slow rising and falling of medieval London, there were few sights more constant than the builders, the men who shaped the city, not with dreams or power, but with their bare, calloused hands. From dawn until the last light slipped behind the rooftops, they worked among stone and dust, their bodies moving in rhythm with the sound of chisels and hammers. Cathedrals, churches, bridges, walls, all bore the marks of their labor, though no one would remember their names. They were the silent architects of endurance, stacking stone upon stone until the day itself faded. The air around the building sites was thick with chalk and lime, a haze that settled on hair and clothes, whitening everything like a fine, ghostly snow. The work was dangerous, slow, and unending. Wooden scaffolds swayed with the wind, ropes frayed, and the weight of stone was always ready to betray the man who carried it. Yet they came every morning, gathering their tools and climbing toward the sky, as if duty itself was carved into their bones. The master mason stood above them, marking lines on blocks of limestone, measuring, muttering, directing. His craft was a mixture of art and geometry, learned through years of apprenticeship, of watching and failing, of beginning again. Beneath him, the laborers did the heavy work, lifting, hauling, mixing mortar, turning raw materials into the skeleton of a city. Their hands were never clean, their backs never straight. But there was pride in their fatigue. To build was to leave something behind, even if no one would ever speak their name aloud. The great churches of London, St. Paul's among them, rose not by faith alone, but by sweat, by bruised shoulders, by the rhythm of men who worked until their arms shook. Each stone was a story, each wall a testament to unrecorded strength. They ate their meals, sitting on piles of rubble, tearing at bread, hardened by the morning chill, washing it down with ale gone warm. The conversation was simple. The weather, the pay, the aches that never faded. Laughter came rarely, but when it did, it echoed strangely against the stone, deep and human. Above them, bells tolled, and pigeons circled the unfinished towers. The builders paid no mind. They had their own rhythm, their own faith, faith not in heaven, but in the act of building itself. To them, the city was alive, breathing through mortar and wood, growing like a vast, slow creature that they alone understood. When evening came, the tools were gathered and the fires went out. The men trudged home, their clothes dusted white, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. They passed through streets filled with merchants and beggars, through smells of bread and sewage, through noise and silence alike. To most, they were invisible, part of the scenery, like the walls they raised. But in truth, they were the bones of the city, the unseen hands that gave it shape. Their lives were short, often ended by accident or exhaustion, yet their work outlived them by centuries. The stones they placed remained long after their names turned to dust, holding up arches that caught the sun and towers that reached the clouds. It is easy now to look at the cathedrals and see only beauty, but behind every curve, every shadow, lies the echo of labor, the steady breathing of men who carried the weight of time itself. And though no monument bears their likeness, every wall in old London is, in its own quiet way, their grave and their legacy. When the last of the tavern doors closed and the candles in the upper windows burned low, medieval London fell into a silence that was never complete. The night was not truly still. It simply changed its voice. In that half-sleeping hour, when even the river seemed to breathe more slowly, the night watch began its slow, patient patrol, cloaked in rough wool and carrying wooden staves or iron-tipped spears. These men were the guardians of a city that never entirely trusted itself. They walked the cobbled lanes in pairs, lanterns swaying, their light small and trembling against the weight of the dark. The air was damp, filled with the smells of smoke, horse dung, and the faint sweetness of bakeries preparing the dawn's bread. Somewhere, a dog barked, then fell silent. Somewhere else, a shutter creaked. The night watch listened to everything and trusted nothing. Their duty was simple: to keep the peace, to catch the drunk, to sound the alarm at fire or theft. But in truth, their work was mostly waiting, mostly silence. The hours passed slowly. The bells of St. Paul's told each one, their sound heavy with distance, and the watch counted them like weary prayers. The city around them slept uneasily. Fires smoldered in hearths, shadows crept across walls, and the river whispered secrets only the rats could hear. The watchmen moved through it all, their boots scraping softly, their breath visible in the cold. Sometimes they stopped to speak with a late-working baker or a washerwoman who had not yet gone home, exchanging a few quiet words about weather, thieves, or the coming market day. Sometimes they found bodies, a drunk collapsed in the mud, a thief caught by the wrong blade, and they would drag them to the jail without ceremony. It was not heroism that kept them walking, but habit, a sense of duty built not on pride but on repetition. They were paid little, trusted less, and yet without them, the fragile order of the night. Lanterns glowed faintly in doorways, cats darted across alleys, and in the higher quarters, the faint music of a lute drifted through an open window before fading into the mist. The watch passed through it all, like ghosts belonging neither to the living nor the sleeping. They saw things few others did, the beggars huddled under bridges, the lovers whispering behind walls, the pale glow of moonlight on empty streets. Sometimes, when the fog was thick and sound was swallowed whole, they could walk for an hour without hearing anything but their own steps. In those moments, London seemed endless, a labyrinth of silence and stone. And still they walked, because the city depended on that slow, unseen vigilance, that fragile thread of awareness stretched through the hours when most hearts rested by dawn. Their shift ended. The first hint of light touched the river. The roosters crowed, and smoke rose once more from 1,000 chimneys. The watchmen returned to their posts, weary but satisfied that another night had passed without calamity. They hung their lanterns, unbuckled their belts, and sat for a moment in the dull warmth of the guardhouse, listening to the sound of the waking city. Outside, carts began to roll, doors opened, voices rose, the living world returning to motion. For a few brief hours, they would sleep, forgotten by all, until darkness came again and their lonely work resumed. The night watch were not heroes, nor were they saints. They were simply men who walked so others could dream in peace. In their silence, the city found its rest, and in their steady watchfulness, it found its fragile sense of safety. In the narrow, twisting streets of medieval London, sickness was not a visitor, it was a resident. It lived among the people like smoke in the rafters, unseen but always there, creeping into every corner of the city's crowded life. The air itself seemed heavy, carrying the smells of rot, waste, and wood smoke, blending into a staleness that lingered day and night. Beneath the thin chatter of merchants and the rhythm of church bells, there was always another sound, the cough of a sick child, the wail of a mother, the low moan of someone fading away in a darkened room. Illness did not discriminate. It came for the rich and the poor alike, though the poor suffered more, packed into damp houses where sunlight could never reach. Rats scurried through the alleys, fleas leapt from the straw, and water drawn from the Thames was as brown as the mud that lined its banks. The physicians spoke of humors and balance, of bad air and sinful hearts, but their words could not stop what no one understood. To live in London was to live with the shadow of sickness pressing close, breathing at your shoulder, reminding you that health was only ever borrowed time. The city was not built for healing. Its streets were too tight, its walls too high, its people too many. The refuse of thousands, animal and human alike, ran through open drains that twisted beneath the houses like veins. The stench was inescapable. It clung to everything, soaked into fabric and hair, turning even the cleanest air foul. The hospitals, if they could be called that, were little more than sanctuaries for the dying, small, dark buildings where monks prayed over those beyond saving. The physicians wore long robes and spoke Latin, their authority unquestioned, though their cures were uncertain. They bled the sick, burned herbs, and whispered prayers to drive away invisible demons. And when the illness passed, as sometimes it did, they took the credit and thanked God. When it did not, the city buried its dead quickly, quietly, and moved on. The bells rang, the carts rolled, the markets reopened, and life continued as though nothing had happened, because there was no other choice. But there were moments when the shadow deepened, when the sickness grew too strong to ignore. In those times, fear spread faster than the disease itself. Doors were shut, families abandoned their own, and priests walked the streets with candles held high, chanting for mercy. The smell of burning herbs filled the air, rosemary, sage, and juniper, the city's desperate attempt to mask the stench of death. Some believed the illness came from sin, others from the stars, but no one truly knew. Even the doctors' masks, with their long beaked noses stuffed with flowers, could not stop the invisible enemy. The cemeteries filled until there was no room left, and new pits were dug beyond the city walls. Yet, through it all, London endured, as it always did, weary, coughing, unsteady, but alive. When the worst had passed, the survivors returned to their lives with a strange quietness. They spoke less, moved slower, and prayed more. Children played again in the streets, though their laughter seemed softer now, like an echo of something lost. The city cleaned itself as best it could, washing walls, burning old bedding, blessing the wells, but the shadow remained, waiting, patient. For in medieval London, sickness was not an event but a rhythm, part of the slow heartbeat of a city, too crowded to be clean, too stubborn to die. Every generation learned the same lesson, that health was fragile, that death was close, and that the living had no choice but to walk side by side with both. It began quietly, as most disasters do, a whisper carried by travelers, a rumor in the docks, a merchant's cough that would not go away. Ships came up the Thames, loaded with goods, their hulls heavy with grain, cloth, and something unseen. The rats came first, quick and restless, slipping through the alleys and granaries, their black eyes glinting in the dim light. No one paid them much attention. Rats had always been part of the city, just another piece of its untidy heartbeat. But soon, the sickness followed. A few fell ill, then a few more. The physicians muttered about foul air. The priests spoke of God's anger, and the people prayed, though none could see the shape of what was coming. Within weeks, the sound of bells filled the air, not the cheerful toll of morning, but the slow, heavy ring of mourning. It was the summer of death, and London had begun to choke beneath its own breath. The symptoms came fast and cruel: fever, swelling, dark patches blooming beneath the skin like bruised fruit. People spoke of the pestilence, though few dared say the word aloud. The afflicted were shunned, their houses marked, their bodies left untended. Fear moved faster than reason. Families locked themselves inside, shutters nailed shut, while in the streets, carts rolled by with the grim cry of "Bring out your dead." The sound became part of the night, echoing through every alley, every dream. No one knew who would be taken next. The rich fled the city, retreating to country manors. But even there, the plague followed, unseen, unstoppable. The poor had nowhere to go. They huddled in their homes, coughing in the dark. The air thick with smoke from fires, meant to purify but only adding to the suffocating heat. Dogs and cats disappeared, blamed for spreading the illness, though it made no difference. Death did not care for logic. It came where it wished. By the height of it, the city had fallen silent. The markets were empty, the churches full. Bells tolled without pause, and the Thames carried more sorrow than trade. Graves filled too quickly, and soon the ground itself could not hold the weight of the dead. Whole families vanished. Streets stood deserted. Doors hung open to houses where no one lived anymore. The few who remained walked as if in a dream, faces covered, eyes hollow. Priests moved from house to house, carrying candles and muttering prayers, their robes brushing against the walls, still warm with fever. The smell of death lingered in every corner, a thick sweetness that clung to the throat. The physicians' masks, with their long beaks stuffed with herbs, looked like something from a nightmare, birds of death wandering through the haze. And yet, even then, life refused to vanish completely. Somewhere, a child cried. Somewhere, a baker lit his fire. Somewhere, a woman washed clothes in the river, because there was nothing else to do when the worst had passed. The survivors emerged into a city that did not feel like their own. The streets were quieter, the air thinner. Weeds grew between the cobblestones, and the bells rang less often now, as if even they were weary. People spoke in whispers, afraid that the very sound of their voices might wake the plague again. The survivors carried not just memory, but guilt for living when others had not, for breathing in a city that had forgotten how to. And yet, slowly, the rhythm of life returned. The markets reopened, the ships sailed again, and the churches filled with prayers of both grief and gratitude. But something in London had changed forever. The plague had left its mark, not only in graves and ruins, but in the quietness that followed, as though the city itself remembered the sound of death and would never truly forget. In a city drowning beneath the weight of sickness, there were still those who tried to fight it: the healers, the monks, the apothecaries, and the nameless women who carried herbs in their aprons and prayers in their breath. They moved through the narrow streets of medieval London like pale figures between worlds, half believing in hope, half accepting its futility. The physicians, proud and certain in their knowledge of humors, still spoke of balance and bad air, of bile and phlegm, though their cures cured nothing. They bled the fevered, burned rosemary to cleanse the air, and covered their faces with vinegar-soaked cloths. But the sickness slipped through every barrier they built. The monks in the infirmaries worked without rest, tending to the dying with hands that trembled from exhaustion. They washed the bodies, whispered last rites, and prayed until their own voices cracked. The apothecaries mixed their potions in dim candlelight powders of crushed bark, oil of cloves, ground wormwood, dried lavender, each mixture more desperate than the last. And still, the coughs continued, the fevers deepened, and death came all the same. The healers did what they could, not because they believed they would win, but because to do nothing would have been worse. Among them were women, the city rarely named midwives and herbwives, healers of the poor. They worked from small rooms that smelled of sage and smoke, offering poultices made from nettles, comfrey, and honey. Some said their hands were blessed. Others whispered that they were cursed. In truth, they were simply human, steady, practical, and unafraid to touch the sick when others would not. They knew that comfort mattered more than cure. Sometimes, all they could offer was a damp cloth on a burning brow, or a few quiet words to a mother losing her child. The city called them wise women when they succeeded, and witches when they failed. And yet, they remained always present in the spaces between fear and faith. The hospitals were few and small, run mostly by monks and nuns who believed that caring for the sick brought them closer to God. Their halls were filled with low murmurs and candlelight, with the sound of breath turning shallow and slow. The healers walked from bed to bed, their feet dragging across the cold stone floors, their faces hidden by exhaustion. They prayed over the dying, but they prayed also for themselves, for strength, for sleep, for the ability to keep going. Each body that left their care was another failure they carried like a wound. And yet, every morning they began again. Outside, the bells never stopped ringing. The plague carts rolled on, and the city seemed to sigh beneath its own grief. Still, the healers moved through it all, steady as shadows, fragile as faith. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when someone lived. A child's fever broke. An old man opened his eyes after days of stillness. A woman who had been left for dead rose from her bed and walked into the sun. The healers saw these things and held them close, like small flames in a world made of darkness. They did not speak of miracles, but they remembered them, because in those moments, even the hopelessness seemed bearable. Even the endless toll of bells could sound like something softer, and so they kept working. Long after the plague had passed, long after the city had begun to breathe again, they were still there, the monks, the apothecaries, the women with herbs. They stitched wounds, soothed fevers, whispered prayers. They knew the sickness would return, as it always did, but for now, their hands were steady, and the city was quiet. It was enough. There came a time in medieval London when the living could no longer keep pace with the dead. The plague had filled every corner, every churchyard, every breath, and now it filled the ground itself. Graves once dug carefully by hand became shallow pits, widened day by day as the number of bodies grew. The bell ringers could no longer count the hours. Their tolling became one long, mournful note stretched across the city. Men with carts rolled through the streets at dawn and dusk, calling out in tired voices, "Bring out your dead." Doors opened silently, bundles were lifted, faces covered, names unspoken. The carts rumbled away, leaving behind only the sound of wheels grinding through mud and the echo of quiet prayers whispered through closed shutters. Death had lost its ceremony. There were no funerals, no final words, only the soft rhythm of earth being turned again and again. Outside the city walls, new burial grounds were opened. Fields once green became gray with mounds of fresh soil. The smell was heavy, sweet, sour, unforgettable. Priests walked among the pits with candles that flickered in the wind, their Latin prayers swallowed by the cries of crows. There was no order to it, no record. The rich and the poor, the young and the old, all lay together, nameless in the dark. Sometimes the ground gave way beneath the weight of so many bodies, and the earth itself seemed to sigh. In the quiet hours, when the wind blew from the south, the smell of decay drifted back into the city. A grim reminder that even the walls could not keep death away. People spoke in whispers, avoided the graveyards, crossed themselves at the sound of distant digging. Yet, for the gravediggers, the work never stopped. They labored without pause, their faces pale, their hands blistered, their clothes soaked with rain and sweat. They became part of the landscape of death, moving through the mist like ghosts still bound to their duty. The city's silence deepened. Streets once filled with laughter and commerce now held only footsteps and the creak of wooden wheels. The bells that once marked the hours of prayer now marked the rhythm of loss. Inside the churches, candles burned low before statues whose eyes seemed weary with watching. The priests spoke of salvation, but even they had begun to falter, their voices soft, uncertain. Many of them fell ill themselves, buried beside those they had blessed only days before. And yet, life clung on in small, stubborn ways. Flowers still grew along the edges of the graves. Birds still sang in the early morning, though their songs sounded thinner now. Somewhere, a mother whispered her child's name before covering the small face with cloth. Somewhere, a man paused beside a mound of earth that held his wife, unable to speak, unable to leave. The silence of the dead had become the sound of the living, heavy, endless, and shared by all. When at last the plague began to fade, when the bells tolled less often and the carts no longer passed through the streets, London looked upon itself and did not know what it saw. The graveyards were full, the churches dim, the air changed. The survivors moved through their days softly, as if afraid to wake the ghosts that surrounded them. Grass grew over the pits, and the earth settled, hiding what it held. The city began to rebuild, slowly, cautiously, carrying its grief in the folds of every prayer, every step, every quiet breath. In the centuries that followed, the graves of the plague dead would be forgotten, built over by houses, roads, and walls. But beneath the cobblestones, beneath the noise of time, they would remain, an unspoken memory in the city's soil. And when the wind turned cold and the night fell still, it was said that if you listened closely, you could still hear the faintest echo of shovels in the dark, the slow, patient rhythm of a city burying its sorrow. When the bells finally stopped tolling and the carts of the dead no longer rolled through the streets, a strange stillness settled over medieval London. It was not peace, not truly, but something quieter, a hollow calm that came after too much grief. The survivors stepped out of their shuttered homes, blinking against the light, uncertain whether the world they had returned to was the same one they had left. The city looked different, even to familiar eyes. Whole streets were empty, houses stood open to the wind, and weeds crept through cracks in the cobblestones. The air smelled faintly of ashes and herbs, of life trying to begin again. People spoke in low voices, careful not to disturb the fragile balance that had replaced the chaos. They had learned to move slowly, to touch softly, to listen before speaking. The laughter that once echoed from taverns and markets now sounded hesitant, like a memory being tested. Yet there was something steady in their weariness, the quiet persistence of those who had faced death and continued, breathing simply because they could not do otherwise. The survivors carried more than loss. They carried silence, the kind that lives in the bones after too many goodbyes. They remembered faces without names, rooms without voices, the weight of stillness where noise had once been. Many left offerings at church altars, candles burning for those they would never see again. Others turned away from faith entirely, unable to understand how such suffering could be allowed. London's streets, once bursting with noise and color, now felt like the inside of a sigh. But slowly, inevitably, the rhythms of life began to return. The bakers lit their ovens, the smiths struck iron once more, and the children, fewer now, quieter, began to play again in the dust. Every act of ordinary living felt like defiance. To eat, to laugh, to plant a seed, all these were small rebellions against the memory of the plague. The city had lost half its people, but those who remained began to build again, brick by brick, breath by breath. In the aftermath, nothing was quite the same. The old hierarchies had weakened. The rich found fewer servants to command, and the poor found their labor suddenly worth more. The city's rhythms changed, its markets shifted, its faith deepened and fractured all at once. The survivors lived with a constant awareness of fragility, that everything solid could crumble, that life was a borrowed thing. Yet there was beauty in that fragility, too. The sunsets seemed softer, the church bells gentler, the quiet between them somehow sacred. People began to keep their dead closer in memory, in prayer, in the stories whispered at night. The city that had once been only noise and survival became, for a time, a place of reflection. Years later, when the scars of the plague were hidden beneath new walls and generations had been born who did not remember, the silence remained not as fear, but as wisdom. The survivors had taught the city something it would never forget, that endurance is quieter than strength, that hope can exist even in the ruins. The Thames kept flowing, the markets returned, and the bells once again rang for weddings instead of funerals. But somewhere in the sound of every morning, in the mist over the river, in the echo of footsteps before dawn, there lingered the faint remembrance of what had been lost. London, scarred and stubborn, carried on, its people both haunted and healed. And though the plague had passed, it left behind something that would never die, the quiet understanding that to live is to endure, and to endure is somehow enough. In medieval London, faith was not a choice. It was the air that people breathed, the rhythm by which the city moved, the quiet hum beneath every sound of daily life. The church bells marked the hours, and with them came a sense of order in a world that so often felt cruel and uncertain. The people lived under the gaze of saints and the promise of salvation, and yet their faith was threaded through with fear. The priests spoke of heaven and hell with equal certainty, of a God who watched everything and a devil who waited patiently for those who strayed. Each sickness, each fire, each failed harvest was seen as both punishment and test. To live was to hope that God had not turned his face away, and to die was to trust that the soul might still find mercy. In the dim light of the churches, where incense curled like slow smoke toward the rafters, men and women knelt in silence, their whispers lost beneath the low chanting of the monks. The candles flickered before the icons of saints, and in their trembling light, the faithful searched for meaning in every shadow. The city itself was shaped by belief. Crosses were carved above doorways to keep evil spirits at bay. Holy water was sprinkled on sickbeds, and every journey began with a prayer. The people of London walked with superstition as closely as they did with faith to them. The world was alive with unseen forces, both kind and cruel. They believed that sins could cling to a person like dust, and that a prayer could wash them away. In every market, in every tavern, there were murmurs of miracles and warnings of omens. A sudden storm, a stillborn child, a candle that refused to burn. All were signs of something larger, something divine or demonic. And yet, faith offered comfort. In the vast uncertainty of life, the church gave structure, a story to hold on to, a promise that the suffering of this world had meaning in the next. On Sundays, the bells called everyone to Mass. The streets would empty as men, women, and children filed into the great stone churches that rose like mountains amid the crooked houses. Inside, the air was heavy with incense and the sound of voices rising together. Latin words filled the hall. Few understood them, but all felt their weight. The priest, robed in gold and red, stood before the altar, lifting the chalice, his voice echoing against the cold stone. Outside, the sunlight moved across the cobbles, and for that brief hour, the city seemed to breathe in unison. But even as they prayed, the people carried their fears with them. Fear of sin, fear of judgment, fear of the unknown that waited beyond death. The church offered answers, but never without warning. Salvation had to be earned, and sin was always near. For the poor, faith was both solace and submission. They believed that their suffering was part of God's plan, that the hunger and toil of this life would be repaid in heaven. The wealthy, too, clung to faith, but theirs was gilded with comfort. They built chapels, funded masses, bought prayers for their souls. Yet in death, all were equal. When the plague came, when the fires burned, when famine swept through the streets, even the richest found themselves on their knees beside the poorest, praying to the same silent God. In that silence lay the truest kind of faith, not the loud, confident kind, but the trembling belief that somehow, amidst all the pain and loss, there was still something beyond it. When the candles burned low and the bells fell quiet, London's faith remained not bright and sure, but steady, like a small light flickering against the wind, refusing to go out. In the narrow streets of medieval London, the world spoke softly, and the people listened with uneasy hearts. Every flicker of a candle, every strange sound in the night, every shiver of wind against the shutter was a message, a sign that something unseen was at work. The air itself seemed to hum with mystery. When the moon turned red, people whispered that it was a warning from heaven. When a black cat crossed their path, they muttered prayers beneath their breath. It was a world where the line between faith and fear was thin, and superstition filled the space between what men could not understand and what they could not control. The city was alive with omens, in the cawing of crows at dawn, in the sudden death of livestock, in dreams that lingered too vividly upon waking. To ignore these signs was to invite danger, for people believed that the unseen watched closely and punished arrogance. And so they carried charms of iron or bone, tied herbs above their doors, and traced crosses on their windows to keep evil away. These small rituals were not questioned. They were as natural as breathing in a world without certainty. Every superstition was a kind of fragile protection. The church frowned upon such beliefs, calling them pagan remnants, yet even priests were not immune to them. Behind closed doors, they too might glance anxiously at the sky when thunder rolled too long, or bless themselves when a dog howled at night. For all their learning, they lived in the same world as everyone else, a world filled with sickness and sudden death, where reason often bent beneath the weight of fear. Superstition, in its quiet way, gave order to chaos. If crops failed, it was not mere chance, but the work of a witch's curse. If the river flooded, it was a sign of divine displeasure. These explanations, however dark, made the world feel less random. People needed to believe that there were patterns, that somewhere within the uncertainty there was meaning, even if that meaning frightened them. Witchcraft was the shadow that haunted these beliefs. When misfortune struck, people searched for someone to blame: an old woman with too many cats, a neighbor whose herbs grew too well, a midwife whose touch seemed to knowing. They spoke of the devil's mark, of secret pacts made under the moon, of curses whispered into milk and water. Fear turned easily to anger, and anger turned to fire. The accused rarely stood a chance. Sometimes they were spared by luck, more often by death. Yet, even in their terror, people did not see cruelty in what they did. They saw justice, purification, the restoring of balance. The idea that evil might live among them was unbearable, so they burned it, buried it, and when the smoke cleared, they crossed themselves, believing that the world was clean again. But beneath all the superstition, there was something deeply human, a longing to understand, to give shape to the invisible. When a mother hung sprigs of rosemary by her child's cradle, she was not calling on dark magic. She was calling on hope. When a sailor touched a charm before a voyage, he was whispering to fate, asking for mercy. These gestures were prayers of another kind, born not of heresy, but of fear and love entwined. In the end, superstition was simply the language of uncertainty, spoken softly in every home. London, with its smoke and its whispers, learned to live with it, neither fully believing nor fully denying, but always listening, always waiting for the next sign in the quiet. For the people of medieval London, the road itself could be holy. When the burdens of sin grew too heavy, or when the heart ached for forgiveness, men and women left their homes, their trades, and their daily lives to walk the long, uncertain paths of pilgrimage. It was a journey of dust and devotion, of worn boots and whispered prayers. Some set out for Canterbury to kneel where St. Thomas Becket had fallen. Others dreamed of distant shrines in Rome or Santiago. Though few could ever afford to travel so far, they carried little: a staff, a flask of water, a small pouch of bread, and much that could not be seen: guilt, longing, and the quiet hope that miles might wash away what confession could not. The road stretched wide and indifferent before them, passing through meadows, forests, and villages where strangers would greet them with blessings or suspicion. Pilgrims were both revered and pitied. They were holy wanderers and beggars at once. But to walk was to believe, to trust that each step, no matter how weary, brought them closer to grace. The pilgrim's badge became their mark of purpose. Made of lead or pewter, it was pinned to cloak or hat, a tiny symbol that said, "I am seeking something beyond myself." In London's markets, craftsmen sold badges shaped like scallop shells or tiny saints, tokens that glinted faintly in the morning sun. When pilgrims returned, these badges were their proof of faith, their small trophies of endurance. Some wore them proudly to their graves. Others gave them to their children as keepsakes, reminders of promises made on the road. For in those days, the idea of pilgrimage was not only about distance, but about transformation, that by walking, one might leave behind the self that had failed and find another, quieter one in its place. The journey was long, often dangerous. Roads were rough, food scarce, and shelter uncertain. Yet pilgrims moved in small groups, sharing warmth and stories around fires, their faces flickering in the glow. They spoke of miracles and of loss, of saints who had healed the sick, and of sinners who had walked barefoot to redemption. Each story was a thread in the great tapestry of faith that bound them together. The world beyond the city walls felt vast and strange. Rivers to cross, hills to climb, storms that came without warning. But there was peace in the rhythm of walking, in the sound of boots against earth, in the steady repetition of prayer whispered beneath the breath. For those who had known only the noise and closeness of London, the open air was both a trial and a kind of mercy. At the shrines, where candles burned and relics glittered behind glass, the pilgrims finally knelt. Some wept openly, others simply bowed their heads. They offered coins, locks of hair, pieces of cloth, small things, but precious in their meaning. The priests received them kindly, blessing each weary traveler, though not all found what they had come seeking. Many discovered that the journey itself, not the arrival, was the true act of faith. For in the long, quiet miles between leaving and returning, they had faced themselves, their fears, their doubts, their smallness beneath the wide sky. When they came back to London, their feet cracked and their faces tanned by the sun, the city looked different. Its noise seemed softer, its worries smaller. They had walked to remember what they had forgotten, that the soul, like the road, was meant to keep moving. And though the world around them never ceased its hardship, they carried within them a stillness that no storm could shake. As the 14th century faded into the 15th, the people of London began to sense that something within their world was shifting, not loudly, not suddenly, but like a tide that moved so slowly you only felt it when the shore beneath your feet began to change. For centuries, the church had been the compass of every soul, pointing always toward salvation and away from sin. But now, quiet questions began to stir beneath the rhythm of prayer. The plague had come and gone, and come again. Wars had emptied coffers and fields, and yet the heavens had remained silent. Some began to wonder whether the old promises still held, whether the suffering of the innocent was truly part of a divine plan or simply the way of the world. These were dangerous thoughts, and few dared to speak them aloud. But they grew nonetheless, whispered over ale in dark taverns, or pondered in solitude as the bells tolled in the distance. The faith that had once been firm as stone began to tremble. Like a candle flame in the draught of change, the church remained powerful, its towers high and its rituals unchanged. But its hold upon the heart of the people was no longer as certain. The language of Latin, once sacred and mysterious, began to sound like a barrier rather than a bridge. Common folk wanted to hear the word of God in their own tongue, to understand the prayers they had spoken all their lives without knowing their meaning. When John Wycliffe and his followers began translating the Bible into English, it was both an act of devotion and quiet rebellion. The idea that faith could live outside the church's authority was unsettling, even dangerous. Yet once a thought like that takes root, it cannot easily be undone. Slowly, the certainty that had shaped medieval life, the clear lines between right and wrong, heaven and earth, priest and peasant, began to blur. Still, the people did not abandon faith. They reshaped it. For many, belief became something more private, less about ceremony and more about endurance. They still lit candles before saints, still prayed for mercy, but their hope rested more in the small miracles of survival, a good harvest, a safe birth, a day without pain. The world seemed wider now, filled with both wonder and doubt. Pilgrims still walked, but their steps were slower. Priests still preached, but their words carried the weight of unease. The promise of salvation had not vanished, but it no longer glowed so brightly. It flickered, fragile, human, and perhaps truer for it. In this quiet unraveling, the medieval mind began to give way to something new. The merchants who traveled across seas saw lands untouched by their faith. The scholars who read ancient texts rediscovered ideas that predated their church. The artists who painted saints began to see beauty in the faces of ordinary men and women. Slowly, a new world was being born, one that asked not only what to believe, but why. Yet even as this new light dawned, the old shadows remained. The bells still rang each morning, the incense still rose, the people still knelt, though some did so now with eyes half open watching, wondering. The end of certainty did not come with a cry, but with a sigh, the long, soft breath of an age growing weary of its own faith. And yet, in that weariness, there was something tender, even hopeful. To doubt was not to abandon God. It was to seek Him anew, beyond the walls of stone and the Latin of priests. In the centuries that followed, London would rise again and again, in fire, in war, in renewal. But beneath every change, a quiet truth would remain, that belief, like the city itself, endures not because it is perfect, but because it persists. And so, as the candles burned low in the churches of medieval London, and as the wind moved through the empty streets, faith did not end, it merely changed its shape, settling into the silence like dust that still remembers the light.